They crashed Billy Fullerton's wedding armed with bottles instead of confetti. They marked their territory with shamrocks painted in blood. And for 4 decades, they stood as the only Catholic gang brave enough to face the 800-strong Billy Boys in open warfare. This is the story of the Norman Conks, Glasgow's forgotten razor army. Norman Street, Bridgeton, Glasgow. Less than half a kilometer from Bridgeton Cross, where the Billy Boys assembled. Close enough to hear their flutes playing Protestant anthems. Close enough to smell the violence coming. The Catholics living on Norman Street had 2 choices, run or fight. They chose to fight. And in choosing violence, they created one of Scotland's most feared razor gangs. The name itself was a challenge. Norman Conks. Conk was slang for conqueror. They were calling themselves the Norman Conquerors, a direct historical reference to William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066. Catholic invaders who'd once ruled Britain. It was a middle finger raised to every Protestant gang in Glasgow. The Billy Boys worshipped King William of Orange, the Protestant victor of 1690. The Norman Conks worshipped William the Conqueror, the Catholic who'd taken England by force 6 centuries earlier. History weaponized in razor gang form. If you're fascinated by the violent sectarian warfare that consumed Glasgow for decades, hit that like button now. We're diving deep into the gang the history books tried to erase. The Catholics who refused to surrender. The razor fighters who made even the Billy Boys bleed. The Norman Conks emerged in the 1880s as what Glaswegians called a penny mob. Small neighborhood gangs of young boys who'd fight over literally anything. A football match, an insult. Someone walking on the wrong side of the street. But penny mobs were disorganized, chaotic. The Norman Conks evolved into something far more dangerous. By the 1920s, they'd transformed from street corner boys into a structured criminal organization with territory, hierarchy, and weapons. Their base was Norman Street in the Dalmarnock and Bridgeton area. This was Catholic Glasgow. Irish immigrant families crammed into tenements. Men who'd fled poverty in Ireland only to find poverty in Scotland. They worked the shipyards when work existed. They drank when it didn't. And their sons, born in Glasgow but raised on stories of Irish oppression, grew up angry. The Norman Conks gave that anger direction. Walk down Norman Street in 1925, and you'd see the gang's signature everywhere. Shamrocks painted on brick walls, green paint splashed across doorways. These weren't decorations. They were territorial markers, warnings. This street belonged to the Norman Conks. Protestant gangs entered at their own risk. And when the Billy Boys marched their flute bands down Norman Street, singing their sectarian anthems, the Conks would pour from the tenements armed with razors, bottles, hammers, and pure rage. The religious divide was everything. This wasn't just gang warfare. It was holy war fought in Glasgow's slums. The Billy Boys represented Protestant supremacy. King William. The Battle of the Boyne. No surrender. The Norman Conks represented Catholic resistance, Irish republicanism, centuries of oppression. Every street fight was the Reformation replayed with razor blades. Every bottle thrown carried 400 years of sectarian hatred. But understanding the Norman Conks requires understanding their enemy. The Billy Boys weren't just a gang. They were a paramilitary organization with 800 members. They had uniforms. Training programs for young recruits called the Derry Boys. They collected weekly dues from members. They had political connections to fascist organizations. The Billy Boys dominated Glasgow's East End through sheer numbers and organized violence. The Norman Conks were smaller, maybe 200 to 300 core members at their peak. They couldn't match Billy Boys' numbers. So they matched them in brutality. Where the Billy Boys were disciplined and organized, the Conks were savage and unpredictable.
They became specialists in ambush tactics, surprise attacks, hit-and-run violence that left Protestant gang members scarred for
life. The razor was their signature weapon, the cutthroat razor. 6 inches of folded steel that could be concealed in a jacket pocket and deployed in seconds. Norman Conks fighters would fold the razor into their palm, blade hidden. When they threw a punch, the razor would open mid-swing. The result was catastrophic. Faces slashed from ear to mouth, the infamous Glasgow smile carved into cheeks. Victims marked permanently. And for the Norman Conks, that was the point. They wanted everyone to see what happened to Billy boys who crossed into Catholic territory. But razors weren't their only weapons. Broken bottles were common, glass sharpened to a point, hammers stolen from shipyards, chains ripped from industrial equipment, and for special occasions, hatchets. The Norman Conks were skilled at improvising weapons from their environment. A tenement close became an arsenal. A shipyard became a weapons depot. Poverty forced creativity, and that creativity was channeled into violence. Norman Conks' membership included women. This was unusual for Glasgow gangs. Most were exclusively male. But the Conks integrated young women into their operations. These women weren't just girlfriends or accessories. They fought. They carried weapons. They acted as lookouts and intelligence gatherers. A young woman could walk through Billy Boy's territory without raising suspicion. She'd return with information on movements, meeting locations, vulnerable targets. Then the Norman Conks would strike. The gang's leadership structure was less formal than the Billy Boys. There was no single charismatic leader like Billy Fullerton. Instead, the Norman Conks operated through a council of senior members, the hardest fighters, the men who'd proven themselves in battle. Decisions were made collectively. This made them harder to decapitate. Arrest one leader and another would rise. The Billy Boys had a king. The Norman Conks had a revolution. Their connections to the Irish Republican Army were both asset and liability. The IRA used Glasgow as a supply point in the 1920s and 1930s. Weapons smuggled from Ireland would arrive in Glasgow, distributed through networks that included gang members. The Norman Conks provided protection and manpower. In exchange, they gained access to guns, real firearms. This escalated the gang wars dramatically. Where fights had been razors and bottles, they now included revolvers and pistols. But IRA connections also brought police scrutiny. British authorities were terrified of Irish republicanism spreading to Scotland. Any gang with IRA links was automatically a national security threat. The Norman Conks found themselves targeted not just by rival gangs, but by special branch. Intelligence officers infiltrated Catholic neighborhoods. Informants were recruited. Surveillance was constant. The gang's political connections made them more dangerous, but also more vulnerable. The violence peaked in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Football matches became battlegrounds. Rangers versus Celtic wasn't just sport. It was Protestant versus Catholic. Billy Boys versus Norman Conks. The gangs would arrive at stadiums in formation, 100 strong. Police would try to keep them separated. It never worked. Fights would erupt in the stands, spill onto the streets, and continue for hours. Casualties were inevitable. Young men carried to hospitals with razor wounds, others arrested and hauled to police stations. And the next week, they'd do it all again. Train stations were another flashpoint. Glasgow's railway system connected Protestant and Catholic neighborhoods. When Norman Conks members traveled through Bridgeton station, they were in enemy territory. The Billy Boys would be waiting, bottles would fly, razors would flash. The platforms would run with blood. Railway authorities hired private security. It made no difference. The gangs owned the stations. The most infamous incident occurred at Billy Fullerton's wedding. The date was sometime in the late 1920s. Fullerton was marrying, and the Billy Boys had organized a massive celebration. Hundreds of gang members gathered. Flute bands played. Protestant anthems echoed through Bridgeton. It was a display of power, a demonstration that the Billy Boys ruled Glasgow. The Norman Conks couldn't allow that to stand unchallenged. They arrived during the ceremony, dozens of Conks fighters armed with bottles, no razors this time. Glass was the weapon of choice. They launched a coordinated assault. Bottles flew through the air. Windows shattered. Wedding guests scattered. The Billy Boys fought back. What should have been a celebration became a riot. Police arrived to find two gangs battling in the street while a wedding party cowered inside. Multiple arrests were made, but the message was clear. The Norman Conks would never submit. This level of violence couldn't continue indefinitely. Glasgow City Council was under pressure. The newspapers called the city Britain's murder capital. Tourism was suffering. Businesses were relocating. Something had to be done. In 1931, Percy Sillitoe arrived as Glasgow's new chief constable. He'd broken gangs in Sheffield and Liverpool. Now he'd break them in Glasgow. Sillitoe's approach was overwhelming force. He created special squads called the Untouchables. Officers handpicked for physical size and immunity to bribery. These weren't ordinary constables. They were gang hunters. They patrolled in groups of 6 or more. They raided gang headquarters at dawn. They arrested members for any offense, no matter how minor. Loitering, public intoxication, swearing. Sentences that previously would have been days became months. Repeat offenders faced years in Barlinnie prison. The Norman Conks fought back. But fighting police was different from fighting rival gangs. Slash a Billy Boy and he might not report it. Gang code. But slash a police officer and the full weight of the law descended. Sillitoe's officers were authorized to use batons with brutal efficiency. Gang members hospitalized with broken bones learned that police violence was state-sanctioned, legal, and there was no revenge available. Sillitoe also targeted the social infrastructure that supported the gangs. Pubs where Norman Conks gathered were raided repeatedly. Landlords who allowed gang meetings lost their licenses. Tenement buildings used as headquarters were subject to constant police presence. The gang's ability to operate openly was destroyed. They went underground. But underground operations were harder to maintain. Recruitment suffered. Young boys saw Norman Conks members being arrested and beaten and decided the gang life wasn't worth it. The economic situation also changed. The early 1930s saw a slight improvement in Glasgow's employment. Shipyards began hiring again. Not enough to end poverty, but enough to give young men options. A job, even a terrible one, was better than prison. Some Norman Conks members aged out. They got married, had children. The gang life that seemed glorious at 18 looked stupid at 30. Gradually, the hardcore membership declined. Then came the Second World War. Suddenly, young Catholic and Protestant men were fighting the same enemy. Nazis didn't care about Glasgow sectarianism. German bombs didn't distinguish between Norman Street and Bridgeton Cross. Norman Conks and Billy Boys found themselves in the same regiments, in the same foxholes, bleeding the same blood. It didn't erase the hatred, but it complicated it. Hard to maintain gang warfare when you'd saved each other's lives in France. By 1945, the Norman Conks were a shadow of their former strength. The gang still existed, but their power was broken. Percy Sillitoe had moved on to lead MI5. The police crackdown eased. But the culture had changed. Post-war Glasgow was different. Housing programs relocated families from the worst slums. Television provided entertainment that didn't involve razor fights. Football remained sectarian, but less violently so. The conditions that created the Norman Conks no longer existed. The gang lingered through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. By then, they were mostly older men telling stories in pubs, reminiscing about the days when Norman Street was Catholic territory, when shamrocks marked boundaries, when the Billy Boys feared to march, but that Glasgow was gone. The tenements were being demolished. Norman Street itself was disappearing under redevelopment. The physical landscape of gang territory was erased. Some Norman Conks members found legitimate work. Others fell into alcoholism and poverty. A few continued criminal careers outside the gang structure. Small-time theft. Fences for stolen goods. But the organized violence was over. No more razor fights, no more sectarian battles, just aging men with scars and memories. What makes the Norman Conks fascinating is how completely they've been forgotten. The Billy Boys have books written about them, documentaries, academic studies. Billy Fullerton is remembered as a villain, but he's remembered. The Norman Conks have virtually nothing. No comprehensive history. No famous leaders whose names survived. They've been erased from Glasgow's narrative. Part of this is because they were Catholic. Glasgow's historical establishment was predominantly Protestant. The stories that got preserved were Protestant stories. The Billy Boys could be studied as an aberration, a dangerous but ultimately defeated threat. The Norman Conks were embarrassing, evidence that Catholics fought back, that Irish immigrants didn't just accept oppression, so they were quietly forgotten. But their legacy remains in subtle ways. The sectarianism that fueled the gang wars never fully disappeared. Rangers versus Celtic matches still carry religious undertones. Orange walks still march through Glasgow, provoking controversy. The Battle of the Boyne is still commemorated centuries later. The Norman Conks may be gone, but the divisions they represented persist. The weapon they popularized, the razor, became synonymous with Glasgow violence. For decades after the gang wars ended, razor attacks continued. The technique they perfected, the Glasgow smile, became internationally known. A specific style of violence that marked you as either victim or perpetrator in Glasgow's underworld. The Norman Conks didn't invent the razor as weapon, but they elevated it to art form. Their female members were ahead of their time in a dark way. Most gangs excluded women entirely. The Norman Conks integrated them. This wasn't feminism. It was pragmatism. But it demonstrated that women could be just as violent and committed as men when fighting for territory and identity. Later female gangs in Glasgow, like the Nudies, followed patterns established by Norman Conks women. The IRA connections are a historical footnote that deserves more attention. Glasgow was a crucial node in Irish Republican networks. Weapons flowed through the city. Money was raised in Catholic neighborhoods. The Norman Conks weren't just a street gang. They were part of a larger political struggle. Their razor fights had ideological dimensions that pure territorial gangs lacked. They were fighting for more than just Norman Street. They were fighting for Catholic rights in a Protestant city. When historians study Glasgow gang violence, they focus on the Billy Boys because the records are more complete. Billy Fullerton gave interviews. Police files documented Billy Boys' activities extensively. The Norman Conks left fewer traces. They were more secretive, less interested in publicity. Their violence was quieter but no less real. Reconstructing their history requires detective work. Court records, newspaper crime reports, oral histories from aging Glaswegians who remember when Norman Street was dangerous. The shamrocks painted on walls were territorial markers, but also symbols of resistance. The shamrock represented Ireland, Catholic identity, St. Patrick. When a Norman Conk painted a shamrock on a tenement wall, he was claiming that space for Catholic Glasgow. Protestant gangs would deface them, paint Union Jacks over them. Then the Conks would return and restore the shamrocks. This endless cycle of symbolic warfare reflected the deeper conflict. Territory wasn't just physical, it was religious, cultural, historical. The bottles thrown at Billy Fullerton's wedding weren't random violence. They were calculated insult. Weddings are sacred, community celebrations. By attacking the wedding, the Norman Conks were saying that Billy boys had no safe spaces, that even their most important moments would be disrupted. It was psychological warfare, demonstrating that power had limits, that the Billy boys, for all their numbers and organization, couldn't prevent Conks from striking when and where they chose. Modern Glasgow barely remembers the Norman Conks. Their territory has been completely redeveloped. Norman Street still exists, but it's unrecognizable. New housing, different demographics, no shamrocks on walls, no gang members gathering on corners. The physical evidence is gone. Only the name remains, and even that means nothing to most Glaswegians under 50. But for those who study Glasgow's violent past, the Norman Conks represent something important. Proof that oppressed communities fight back. That Irish Catholics in 1920s, Glasgow refused to accept second-class status. They chose violence. That choice had terrible consequences. Young men died. Families were destroyed. But it also demonstrated pride, defiance, a refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The gang lasted roughly 80 years, if you count from their penny mob origins in the 1880s to their final dissolution in the 1960s. 8 decades of violence. Multiple generations of Norman Street families sent their sons into the Conks. Grandfathers who'd fought in the 1890s had grandsons fighting in the 1950s. Gang membership became almost hereditary, a family tradition of violence passed down like a trade. Percy Silito's crackdown was effective, but it wasn't the only factor that destroyed the Norman Conks. The war mattered. Economic changes mattered. But so did exhaustion. You can only sustain that level of violence for so long before people break. The generation that came of age in the 1940s and 50s had seen what gang warfare cost. They'd buried friends, visited brothers in prison, lived with scarred fathers, and many decided it wasn't worth continuing. The cycle broke not through police action, but through collective decision to stop. Still, romanticizing the Norman Conks is a mistake. They weren't freedom fighters, they were a street gang. Their violence was often indiscriminate. Innocent people caught in razor attacks, bystanders injured in street battles, women terrorized, children traumatized. The sectarian warfare they participated in poisoned Glasgow for generations. Whatever pride or defiance motivated them, the cost was too high. The historical irony is that both the Billy Boys and Norman Conks were products of the same conditions: poverty, unemployment, overcrowding, lack of opportunity. The religious divide was real, but it was also convenient. It gave meaningless violence meaning. Protestant and Catholic gang members had more in common with each other than with the wealthy Glaswegians who lived in safe neighborhoods. But they never realized that. Or if they did, they couldn't act on it. The sectarian hatred was too deeply ingrained. Today, Glasgow has moved beyond its razor gang past. The city markets itself as cultural destination, architecture, music, art. The violence is history. Tourists walk streets that once ran with gang blood and have no idea. That's probably healthy. Cities need to evolve. But forgetting entirely is dangerous. The Norman Conks existed. Their violence was real. The scars they left, both physical and cultural, shaped Glasgow into what it is today, understanding that history matters. The Norman Conks were Scotland's Catholic razor army. They fought the Billy Boys to a standstill for decades. They marked their territory with shamrocks and blood. They crashed weddings with bottles. They connected street violence to Irish republicanism, and then they disappeared, erased by time, redevelopment, and historical amnesia. But they existed, and their story deserves to be told. If you want to understand how the Billy Boys fit into this story and why they ultimately outlasted the Norman Conks, check out our Billy Boys documentary, link in the description. Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into Britain's forgotten gang wars. The shamrocks are painted over, the razors are rusted, but the stories remain.